There is a little garden full of white flowers before this little house, which is sunken in a green hillock to the lintel of its door. The white flowers are full of honey. Yellow butterflies and bees suck at them. The unseen wind comes rushing like a presence and a power which the heart feels only. The white flowers press together before it in a soft tumult, and shake out fragrance like censers, but the bees and the butterflies cling to them blowing. The crickets chirp in the green roof of the house unceasingly. The clocks, which have told off the past, so I like clocks which have told off the past and will tell off the future. I pray you, friend, who dwells in this little house sunken in the green hillock, with the white flower garden before the door? A dead man. Passes he ever out of his little dwelling and down the path between his white flower bushes? He never passes out. There is no chimney in that grassy roof. How fares he when the white flowers are gone and the white storm drives? He feels it not. Had he happiness? His heart broke for it. Does his heart pain him in there? He has forgot. Comes ever anybody here to visit him? His widow comes in her black veil and weeps here, and sometimes his old mother, wavering out in the sun like a black shadow. And he knows it not? He knows it not. He knows not of his little prison house in the green hillock, of his white flower garden, of the winter storm, of his broken heart, and his beloved, who yet bear the pain of it, and send out their thoughts to watch with him in the wintry nights. He knows it not. Only the living know? Only the living. Then the tombs be not for the dead, but the living. I would that I were dead, that I might be free from the tomb, and sorrow, and death. And that was a piece called Death, by, again, tonight's author, Mary Wilkins Freeman. And, yeah, cold open, there you go. So this book has two short poems by her, the one at the start, In the Marshland, and this one that they put at the end, Death. You can see why. It's sad. But yeah, it's really good, and I thought I would open with it again. Surprise. But yeah, hello everybody, I'm Sam and you are listening to Chilliteracy, where tonight we've got more of that. Yeah, wonderful ambience, New England ghosts, and other such assorted things. But first, I have to thank Andy Pants for the sub. Thank you very much. 8 months. It feels like it's been shorter and as ever longer. It's an odd one. But yeah, thank you very much. Much appreciated. Always a pleasure to see you here, and everyone else as well. I see the hat. Going to be lurking most of the day. Absolutely fine. Ooh, working on a tile repair in the shower. Good luck. I dread the day I have to do anything like that. Ray Tracer, hello as well. I hope the sci-fi and fantasy con that you've been at, yeah, congratulations on selling some vampire novels. That's neat. Lucy's here as well, which is always great. Thank you for being here. You found out this author lived in Vermont for a long period, so, as in Mary Freeman? If so, awesome. Yeah, she... I just want to talk about how great she is. As in how great her writing is. As a person, like, we've had a couple of people who we've read and then looked into their lives and been like, oh dear. So I don't know what she's like as a person. Couldn't find anything bad listed on Wikipedia. She was an ardent feminist, which absolutely comes through in her work, and I love that. But yeah, like, I've just absolutely found myself captivated by her writing. Like, the more of these I read, the more I love it. I'm not familiar with Shirley Jackson. I probably should be. You're going to say, oh yeah, she did this. And I go, oh, right, that's Shirley Jackson. But it's not a name off the top of my head that I could name anything that I should know. But yeah, like, well, I mean, Lucy can attest. Just yesterday, The Haunting of Hill House. Oh, okay, very, very alliterative. I have not read that, but I should do. Lucy can attest. Just yesterday, I was literally just sending her pictures of pages from this book to be like, look at this writing, it's so good. And it's just, I don't know, like she, this is true, I was doing that, thank you for backing me up. And I don't know if it's just a me thing, like, because obviously a lot of different authors have different styles and different things that they'll prioritize and ways that they will describe a scene and elements within a scene and characters and objects and stuff like that. And I feel like, I don't know, there's a few that I've read who will tell you that the fence post, this is just an example that popped into my head yesterday, it's like, when describing a fence post, they will tell you that it was brown and made of wood, and Mary Wilkins Freeman will tell you what the fence post thinks of you. And that's like the kind of vibe that I get from her. It's like everything is imbued with a personality and has characteristics, and it's, I don't know, it feels to me a lot more atmospheric and emotive, and it's just all things that I can latch onto and like really, it's good. I really like it, and so I'm delighted that there's more stuff in here that I'm going to read. It does mean a lot of American accents. The other thing that Lucy can vouch for, well, like back me up on, was I started reading one, it's like, oh, this is really good, and then like a few minutes later saying, oh no, I think it's entirely written from the perspective of a character narrating and talking, like not narrator text as in this is a character speaking for the entire duration of the story. Oh Lord have mercy, I'm gonna have to do more American accents. And so this is going to be a fun one this evening. It might be a shorter stream than usual, not least because I've recently come off like 4 hours of D&D. But also, the two stories that I have tonight are, I think, both a little bit shorter, but getting into that range of, if I put in a third one, then we're going to go on a long time. So, yeah, I will, first of all, cue you up with the first one, which I read a few weeks ago now. So it's not entirely fresh in my memory, so there may be some stumbles. Forgive me for those, but this will be, when we get there, not just yet, A Gentle Ghost. But yeah, I don't know, there's, and like, I don't mean that as a slam on some of the other authors, like we've I would say pretty much 90 to 95% of the things, certainly that I feel I've read on here, I have enjoyed in some way. Apologies for the creaky chair, by the way. So I'm not saying that as like, oh, I'm just reading a lot of things that I don't enjoy. But there's, when something just hits right, and it the brain just goes, ooh, yeah, no, this is good. It's like when you're at the hairdresser's and it's like, hey, do you want that? Do you want the scalp massage? I'm like, yeah, okay. And it's like, ooh. And it just sort of, it lands like that, and that's just kind of what I get from this writing over sort of some of the other ones that we read. And I kind of almost mercifully can't think of examples of ones that I've kind of been like, yeah, that's fine. Because again, I don't want to like run anything down or say, or like, I'm not here to drop a diss track, but I'm getting distracted. But yeah, there's like, I don't know, yeah, so I can feel myself trying to think of examples to be like, that one was good, but didn't enjoy it so much. But yeah, I don't know, I just want to praise the stuff that I enjoy, really. And yeah, I enjoy these short stories. Hey, Lady Mephistopheles, welcome. Hey, Yumika, wow. A name that when it pops up, I'm like, I haven't seen you for time. Good grief, Vod goblining mostly. It is lovely to see you. Welcome. And yeah, Mephistopheles doing okay. Not had my best day, but doing all right. Thank you. It has been a while. Yeah, I hope you are keeping well. It was lovely to see you. Those of you that have turned up, you may want to go back and catch the start, because as I've now gotten apparently into the habit of doing for these ones, as long as they keep giving me short poems to read, I've opened with a cold open. So if you want to hear that, you can go back and hear that. It's right at the start of the stream. But otherwise, yeah, I don't know. We have the first story pinned. I've sat here and said how much I enjoy the author without really going into specific details. Do I carry on and read? Do you want a story, everybody? Would you like to hear about a gentle ghost? How am I feeling about American accents? Well, let's find out. Okay, right. I don't need to leave myself. Let's have a story. Okay, yeah. I don't need to leave myself a marker because that's going in the start of the video. Got some water. If everyone is good and ready. Decent, very sad. You have to miss the John's concert in Cologne. Oh no. Oh, you'll be in Barcelona? Nice. Okay, no, that's good. Yeah, glad you get to see him. But yeah, let's have a story. I'm still never sure, actually, what the best rendition of her name is, because I did do a bit of reading and saw that she added the Eleanor to her name in memory of her late mother. And she was, Mary Eleanor Wilkins for a long time, then married someone, Freeman, I forget his name, sort of later in life, and he had a lot of problems, but that's where she got Freeman from in her name, and it sounded like it wasn't an especially happy marriage, and he ended up being committed to a mental institute, which at the time, there's a lot to go through there, but yeah, it sounds like it wasn't the happiest marriage. But it's always written as Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. It's a lot of names to give, but I don't know. On the site that I've linked, it's just got her as Mary E. Wilkins. So, who knows? But it's by her. And the other thing that I want to say is I feel like these are stories that deserve to be read slowly. That's the other kind of shorthand opinion description that I have formed of these. They deserve to be read slowly and just sort of poured over. They are not hasty, hurried drama fests. You're okay, no worries. Take care. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for stopping in. And yeah, thank you for the resub. Always grateful and appreciated. But yeah, good luck with things and take care and see you around. But yeah, with that said, these stories deserve to be read slowly, so I'm going to try to do that because I have a tendency to try and speed up. But yeah, let's carry on. Let's do a thing. A Gentle Ghost by Mary Eleanor Wilkins Freeman. Out in front of the cemetery stood a white horse and a covered wagon. The horse was not tied, but she stood quite still, her 4 feet widely and ponderously planted, her meek white head hanging. Shadows of leaves danced on her back. There were many trees about the ceremony, and the foliage was unusually luxuriant for May. The 4 women who had come in the covered wagon remarked it. "I never saw the trees so forward as they are this year, seems to me," said one, gazing up at some magnificent gold-green branches over her head. "I was saying so to Mary this morning," rejoined another. "They were uncommon forward, I think." They loitered along the narrow lanes between the lots. 4 homely, middle-aged women, with decorous and subdued enjoyment in their worn faces. They read with peaceful curiosity and interest the inscriptions on the stones. They turned aside to look at the tender, newly blossomed spring bushes, the flowering almonds and the bridal wreaths. Once in a while they came to a new stone, which they immediately surrounded with eager criticism. There was a solemn hush when they reached a lot where some relatives of one of the party were buried. She put a bunch of flowers on a grave. Then she stood looking at it with red eyes. The others grouped themselves deferentially aloof. They did not meet anyone in the cemetery until just before they left. When they had reached the rear and oldest portion of the yard, they were thinking of retracing their steps. They became suddenly aware of a child sitting in a lot at their right. The lot held 7 old, leaning stones, dark and mossy, their inscriptions dimly traceable. Excuse the helicopter. The child sat close to one, and she looked up at the staring knot of women with a kind of innocent keenness, like a baby. Her face was small and fair and pinched. The woman stood eyeing her. "What's your name, little girl?" asked one. She had a bright flower in her bonnet and a smart lift to her chin, and seemed the natural spokeswoman of the party. Her name was Holmes. The child turned her head sideways and murmured something. "What? We can't hear. Speak up. Don't be afraid. What's your name?" The woman nodded the bright flower. The woman nodded the bright flower over her and spoke with sharp pleasantness. "Nancy Wren," said the child with a timid catch of her breath. "Wren?" The child nodded. She kept her little pink, curving mouth parted. "It's nobody I know," remarked the questioner reflectively. "I guess she comes from over there." She made a significant motion of her head towards the right. "Where do you live, Nancy?" she asked. The child also motioned towards the right. "I thought so," said the woman. "How old are you?" 10. The women exchanged glances. "Are you sure you're telling the truth?" The child nodded. "I never saw a girl so small for her age, if she is," said one woman to another. "Yeah," said Mrs. Holmes, looking at her critically. "She is dreadful small. She's considerable smaller than my Mary was. Is there any of your folks buried in this lot?" she said, fairly hovering with affability and determined graciousness. The child's upturned face suddenly kindled. She began speaking with a soft volubility that was an odd contrast to her previous hesitation. "That's Mother," said she, pointing to one of the stones. "And that's Father, and that's John, and Margaret, and Mary Ann, and Mary, and Susan, and the baby, and here's Jane." The women stared at her in amazement. "Was it your—" began Mrs. Holmes, but another woman stepped forward, stoutly impetuous. "Land, it's the Blake lot," said she. "This child can't be any relation to him. You hadn't ought to talk so, Nancy." "It's so," said the child, shyly persistent. She evidently hardly grasped the force of the woman's remark. They eyed her with increased bewilderment. "It can't be," said the woman to the others. "Every one of them Blakes died years ago." "I've seen Jane," volunteered the child with a candid smile in their faces. The stout woman sank down on her knees beside Jane's stone and peered hard at it. "She died 40 years ago this May," said she with a gasp. "I used to know her when she was a child. She was 10 years old when she died. You ain't ever seen her. You hadn't ought to tell such stories." "I ain't seen her for a long time," said the little girl. "What made you say you'd seen her at all?" said Mrs. Holmes sharply, thinking this was capitulation. "I did used to see her a long time ago, and she used to wear a white dress and a wreath on her head. She used to come here and play with me." The women looked at each other with pale, shocked faces. One nervous, one shivered. "She ain't quite right," she whispered. "Let's go." The women began filing away. Mrs. Holmes, who came last, stood about for a parting word to the child. You can't have seen her," she said severely, "and you are a wicked girl to tell such stories. You mustn't do it again, remember." Nancy stood with her hand on Jane's stone, looking at her. "She did," she repeated with mild obstinacy. "There's something wrong about her, I guess," whispered Mrs. Holmes, rustling on after the others. "I see she looked kind of queer the minute I set eyes on her," said the nervous woman. When the four reached the front of the cemetery, they sat down to rest for a few minutes. It was warm, and they had still quite a walk, nearly the whole width of the yard, to the other front corner where the horse and wagon were. They sat down in a row on a bank. The stout woman wiped her face. Mrs. Holmes straightened her bonnet. Directly opposite, across the street, stood two houses, so close to each other that their walls almost touched. One was a large square building, glossily white, with green blinds. The other was low, with a facing of whitewashed stonework reaching to its lower windows, which somehow gave it a disgraced and menial air. There were, moreover, no blinds. At the side of the low building stretched a wide ploughed field where several halting old figures were moving about, planting. There was none of the brave hope of the sower about them. Even across the road one could see the feeble stiffness of their attitudes, the half-palsied fling of their arms. "I declare I shouldn't think them old men over there would ever get that field planted," said Mrs. Holmes, energetically watchful. In the front door of the square white house sat a girl with bright hair. The yard was full of green light from two tall maple trees, and the girl's hair made a brilliant spot of colour in the midst of it. "That's Flora Dunn over there on the doorstep, ain't it?" said the stout woman. "Yes. I should think you could tell her by her red hair." "I knew it. I should have thought Mr. Dunn would have hated to have their house so near the poorhouse. I declare I should." "Oh, he wouldn't mind," said Mrs. Holmes. "He's as easy as old Tilly. It wouldn't have troubled him any if they'd set it right in his front yard. But I guess she minded some. I heard she did. John said there wasn't any need of it. The town wouldn't have set it so near if Mr. Dunn had set his foot down. If Mr. Dunn had set his foot down, he wouldn't have it there. I suppose they wanted to keep that big field on the side clear. But they would have moved it along a little if he'd made a fuss. I tell you what 'tis, I about made up my mind. I don't know as it's scripture, but I can't help it. If folks don't make a fuss, they won't get their rights in this world. If you just lay still and don't rise up, you're going to get stepped on. If people like to be, they can. I don't." "I should have thought he'd have hated to have the poorhouse quite so close," murmured the stout woman. Suddenly Mrs. Holmes leaned forward and poked her head among the other three. She sat on the end of the row. "Say," said she in a mysterious whisper, I want to know if you've heard the stories about the Dunn house." "No? What?" chorused the other women eagerly. They bent over towards her till the four faces were in a knot. "Well," said Mrs. Holmes, cautiously, with a glance at the bright-headed girl across the way, "I heard it pretty straight. They say the house is haunted." The stout woman sniffed and straightened herself. "Haunted?" repeated she. "They say that ever since Jenny died there's been queer noises round the house that they can't account for. You see that front chamber over there, the one next to the poorhouse? Well, that's the room, they say." The women all turned and looked at the chamber windows where some ruffled white curtains were fluttering. "That's the chamber where Jenny used to sleep, you know," Mrs. Holmes went on, "and she died there. Well, they said that before Jenny died, Flora had always slept there with her, but she felt kind of bad about going back there, so she thought she'd take another room. Well, there was the awfullest moaning and taking on up in Jenny's room. When she did that, Flora went back there to sleep." "I shouldn't thought she could," whispered the nervous woman, who was quite pale. "The moaning stopped just as soon as she got in there with a light. You see, Jenny was always terrible timid and afraid to sleep alone, and had a lamp burning all night, and it seemed to them just as if it was her, I suppose." "I don't believe a word of it," said the stout woman, getting up. "It makes me all out of patience to hear people talk such stuff just because the Dunns happen to live opposite a graveyard." "I told it just as I heard it," said Mrs. Holmes stiffly. "Oh, I ain't blaming you. It's the folks that start such stories, and I ain't got any patience with. Think of that dear, pretty little 16-year-old girl haunting the house." "Well, I've told it just as I heard it," repeated Mrs. Holmes, still in a tone of slight umbrage. "I don't ever take much stock in such things myself." The four women strolled along in the covered wagon and climbed in. "I declare," said the stout woman, conciliatingly, "I don't know when I've had such an outing. I feel as if it had done me good. I've been wanting to come down to the cemetery for a long time, but it's most more than I want to walk. I feel real obliged to you, Miss Holmes." The others climbed in. Mrs. Holmes disclaimed all obligations gracefully, established herself on the front seat, and shook the reins over the white horse. Then the party jogged along the road to the village, past outlying farmhouses in rich green meadows, all freckled gold with dandelions. Dandelions were in their height. The buttercups had not yet come. Flora Dunn, the girl on the doorstep, glanced up when they started down the street. Then she turned her eyes on her work. She was sewing with nervous haste. Who are those folks? Did you see, Flora?" called her mother out of the sitting room. "I didn't notice," replied Flora absently. Just then the girl whom the woman had met came lingeringly out of the cemetery and crossed the street. "There's that poor little Wren girl," remarked the voice in the sitting room. "Yes," assented Flora. After a while she got up and entered the house. Her mother looked anxiously at her when she came into the room. "I'm all out of patience with you, Flora," said she. "You're just as white as a sheet. You'll make yourself sick. You're acting dreadful foolish." Flora sank into a chair and sat staring straight ahead with a strained, pitiful gaze. "I can't help it. I can't do any different," said she. "I shouldn't think you'd scold me, Mother." "Scold you? I ain't scolding you, child, but there ain't any sense in your doing so. You'll make yourself sick, and you're all I've got left. I can't have anything happen to you, Flora." Suddenly Mrs. Dunn burst out in a low wail, hiding her face in her hands. "I don't see as you're much better yourself, Mother," said Flora heavily. "I don't know as I am," sobbed her mother, "but I've got you to worry about besides everything else. Oh, dear, dear. I don't see any need of your worrying about me." Flora did not cry, but her face seemed to darken visibly with a gathering melancholy like a cloud. Her hair was beautiful, and she had a charming delicacy of complexion. But she was not handsome. Her features were too sharp, her expression too intense and nervous. Her mother looked like her as to the expression. The features were widely different. It was as if both had passed through one corroding element which had given them the similarity of scars. Certainly, a stranger would at once have noticed the strong resemblance between Mrs. Dunn's large, heavy-featured face and her daughter's thin, delicately outlined one, a resemblance which 3 months ago had not been perceptible. I see if you don't, returned the mother. "I ain't blind." "I don't see what you're blaming me for." "I ain't blaming you, but it seems to me that you might just as well let me go up there and sleep as you." Suddenly the girl also broke out into a wild cry. "I ain't going to leave her. Poor little Jenny, you needn't try to make me, Mother. I won't. Flora, don't. I won't, poor little Jenny. Oh dear. What if it is so? What if it is her? Ain't she got me as well as you? Can't her mother go to her? I won't leave her. I won't. I won't. Suddenly Mrs. Dunn's calmness seemed to come uppermost, raised in the scale by the weighty impetus of the other's distress. Flora, she said, with mournful solemnity, you mustn't do so. It's wrong. You mustn't wear yourself all out over something that maybe you'll find out wasn't so some time or other. Mother, don't you think it is? Don't you? I don't know what to think, Flora. Just then a door shut somewhere in the back part of the house. There's father, said Mrs. Dunn, getting up, and the fire ain't made. Flora rose also, and went about helping her mother to get supper. Both suddenly settled into a rigidity of composure. Their eyes were red, but their lips were steady. There was a resolute vein in their characters. They managed themselves with wrenches, and could be hard even with their grief. They got tea ready for Mr. Dunn and his 2 hired men, then cleared it away, and sat down in the front room with their needlework. Mr. Dunn, a kindly, dull old man, was in there too, over his newspaper. Mrs. Dunn and Flora sewed intently, never taking their eyes from their work. Out in the next room stood a tall clock, which ticked loudly. Just before it struck the hours, it made always a curious grating noise. When it announced in this way the striking of 9, Mrs. Dunn and Flora exchanged glances. The girl was pale, and her eyes looked larger. She began folding up her work. Suddenly, a low, moaning cry sounded through the house, seemingly from the room overhead. "There it is!" shrieked Flora. She caught up a lamp and ran. Mrs. Dunn was following, when her husband, sitting near the door, caught hold of her dress with a bewildered air. He had been dozing. "What's the matter?" said he, vaguely. "Don't you hear it? Didn't you hear it, father?" The old man let go of the dress suddenly. "I didn't hear nothing," said he. "Hark!" But the cry, in fact, had ceased. Flora could be heard moving about in the room overhead, and that was all. In a moment, Mrs. Dunn ran upstairs after her. The old man sat staring. "It's all dumb foolishness," he muttered under his breath. Presently he fell to dozing again, and his vacantly smiling face lopped forward. Mr. Dunn, slow-brained, patient, and unimaginative, had had his evening naps interrupted after this manner for the last 3 months, and there was as yet no cessation of his bewilderment. He dealt with the simple, broad lights of life. The shadows were beyond his speculation. For his consciousness, his daughter Jenny had died and gone to heaven. He was not capable of listening for her ghostly moans in the little chamber overhead, much less of hearing them with any credulity. When his wife came downstairs, finally she looked at him sleeping there, with a bitter feeling. She felt as if set about by an icy wind of loneliness. Her daughter, who was after her own kind, was all the one to whom she could look for sympathy and understanding in this subtle perplexity which had come upon her. And she would rather have dispensed with that sympathy, and heard alone those piteous, uncanny cries, for she was wild with anxiety about Flora. The girl had never been very strong. She looked at her distressfully when she came down the next morning. "Did you sleep any last night?" said she. "Some," answered Flora. Soon after breakfast they noticed the little Wren girl stealing across the road to the cemetery again. "She goes over there all the time," remarked Mrs. Dunn. "I believe she runs away. See her look behind her." "Yes," said Flora apathetically. It was nearly noon when they heard a voice from the next house calling, "Nancy! Nancy! Nancy Wren!" The voice was loud and imperious, but slow and evenly modulated. It indicated well its owner. A woman who could regulate her own angry voice could regulate other people. Mrs. Dunn and Flora heard it understandingly. "That poor little thing will catch it when she gets home," said Mrs. Dunn. "Nancy! Nancy! Nancy Wren!" called the voice again. "I pity the child if Mrs. Gregg has to go after her. Maybe she just fell asleep over there. Flora, why don't you run over there and get her?" The voice rang out again. Flora got her hat and stole across the street a little below the house, so the calling woman should not see her. When she got into the cemetery, she called in her turn, letting out her thin, sweet voice cautiously. Finally, she came directly upon the child. She was in the Blake lot, her little slender body in its dingy cotton dress curled up on the ground close to one of the graves. No one but nature tended those old graves now, and she seemed to be lapsing them gently back to her own lines at her own will. Of the garden shrubs which had been planted about them, not one was left but an old, low-spraying white rose-bush, which had just gotten its new leaves. The Blake lot was at the very rear of the yard, where it verged upon a light wood, which was silently stealing its way over its own proper boundaries. At the back of the lot stood a thicket of little thin trees with silvery twinkling leaves. The ground was quite blue with houstonias. The child raised her little fair head and stared at Flora as if just awakened from sleep. She held her little pink mouth open. Her innocent blue eyes had a surprised look, as if she were suddenly gazing upon a new scene. "Where's she gone?" asked she, in her sweet, feeble pipe. "Where's who gone?" "Jane." "I don't know what you mean. Come, Nancy, you must go home now." "Didn't you see her?" "I didn't see anybody," answered Flora impatiently. "Come." "She was right here." "What do you mean?" "Jane was standing right there, and she had a white dress on and a wreath." Flora shivered and looked around her fearfully. The fancy of the child was overlapping her own nature. "There wasn't a soul here. You've been dreaming, child. Come." "No, I wasn't. I've seen them blue flowers and the leaves winking all the time. Jane stood right there." The child pointed with a tiny finger to a spot at her side. "She hadn't come for a long time before," she added. "She stayed down there." She pointed at the grave nearest her. "You mustn't talk so," said Flora with tremulous severity. "You must get right up and come home. Mrs. Gregg has been calling you and calling you. She won't like it." Nancy turned quite pale around her little mouth and sprang to her feet. "Is Miss Gregg coming?" "She will come if you don't hurry." The child said not another word. She flew along ahead through the narrow paths, and was in the almshouse door before Flora crossed the street. "She's terrible afraid of Mrs. Gregg," she told her mother when she got home. Nancy had disturbed her own brooding a little, and she spoke more like herself. "Poor little thing, I pity her," said Mrs. Dunn. Mrs. Dunn did not like Mrs. Gregg. Flora rarely told a story until she had ruminated a while over it herself. It was afternoon, and the two were in the front room at their sewing before she told her mother about Jane. "Of course she must have been dreaming," Flora said. "She must have been," rejoined her mother. But the two looked at each other, and their eyes said more than their tongues. Here was a new marvel, new evidence of a kind which they had heretofore scented at, these two rigidly walking New England souls, yet walking, after all, upon narrow paths through dark meadows of mysticism. If they never lost their footing, the steaming damp of the meadows might come in their faces. This fancy, delusion, superstition, whichever one might name it, of theirs had lasted now 3 months, ever since young Jenny Dunn had died. There was apparently no reason why it should not last much longer, if delusion it were. The temperaments of these two women, naturally nervous and imaginative, overwrought now by long care and sorrow, would perpetuate it. If it were not delusion, pray what exorcism, what spell of book and bell could lay the ghost of a little timid child who was afraid, alone in the dark? The days went on, and Flora still hurried up to her chamber at the stroke of 9. If she were a moment late, sometimes if she were not, that pitiful low wail sounded through the house. The strange story spread gradually through the village. Mrs. Dunn and Flora were silent about it, but gossip is herself of a ghostly nature, and minds not keys nor bars. There was quite an excitement over it. People affected with morbid curiosity and sympathy came to the house. One afternoon the minister came and offered a prayer. Mrs. Dunn and Flora received them all with a certain reticence. They did not concur in their wishes to remain and hear the mysterious noises for themselves. People called them dreadful close. They got more satisfaction out of Mr. Dunn, who was perfectly ready to impart all the information in his power and his own theories in the matter. "I never heard a thing but once," said he, "and then it sounded more like a cat to me than anything. I guess Mother and Flora are kind of nervous." The spring was waxing late when Flora went upstairs one night with the oil low in her lamp. She had neglected filling it that day. She did not notice it until she was undressed. Then she thought to herself that she must blow it out. She always kept a lamp burning all night, as she had in timid little Jenny's day. Flora herself was timid now. So she blew the light out. She had barely laid her head upon the pillow when the low moaning wail sounded through the room. Flora sat up in bed and listened, her hands clenched. The moan gathered strength and volume. Little broken words and sentences, the piteous ejaculations of terror and distress, began to shape themselves out of it. Flora sprang out of bed and stumbled towards her west window, the one on the almshouse side. She leaned her head out, listening a moment. Then she called her mother with wild vehemence, but her mother was already at the door with a lamp. When she entered, the moans ceased. "Mother!" shrieked Flora. "It ain't Jenny. It's somebody over there at the poorhouse. Put the lamp out in the entry and come back here and listen." Mrs. Dunn set out the lamp and came back, closing the door. It was a few minutes first, but presently the cries recommenced. "I'm going right over there," said Mrs. Dunn. "I'm going to dress myself and go over there. I'm going to have this affair sifted now." "I'm going too," said Flora. It was only 9:30 when the two stole into the almshouse yard. The light was not out in the room on the ground floor, which the overseer's family used for a sitting room. When they entered, the overseer was there asleep in his chair, his wife sewing at the table, and an old woman in a pink cotton dress, apparently doing nothing. They all started and stared at the intruders. "Good evening," said Mrs. Dunn, trying to speak composedly. "We thought we'd come in. We got kind of started. Oh, there 'tis now. What is it, Miss Gregg?" In fact, at that moment, the wail, louder and more distinct, was heard. "Why, it's Nancy," replied Mrs. Gregg with dignified surprise. She was a large woman with a masterly placidity about her. "I heard her a few minutes ago," she went on, and I was going up there to see if she hadn't stopped. Mr. Gregg, a heavy, saturnine old man, with a broad, bristling face, sat staring stupidly. The old woman, in pink calico, surveyed them all with an impersonal grin. "Nancy," repeated Mrs. Dunn, looking at Mrs. Gregg. She had not fancied this woman very much, and the two had not fraternized, although they were such near neighbours. Indeed, Mrs. Gregg was not of a sociable nature, and associated very little with anything but her own duties. "Yes, Nancy Wren," she said, with gathering amazement. "She cries out this way most every night. She's 10 years old, but she's as afraid of the dark as a baby. She's a queer child. I guess maybe she's nervous. I don't know, but she's got notions into her head staying over in the graveyard so much. She runs away over there every chance she can get, and she goes over a queer rigmarole about playing with Jane, and her being dressed in white and a wreath. I found out she meant Jane Blake, that's buried in the Blake lot. I knew there weren't any children around here, and I thought I'd look into it. You know it says Our Father and Our Mother on the folk stones, and there she was calling them Father and Mother. You thought they was right there. I've got most out of patience with the child. I don't know nothing about such kind of folks." The wail continued. "I'll go right up there," said Mrs. Gregg, determinedly taking a lamp. Mrs. Dunn and Flora followed. When they entered the chamber to which she led them, they saw little Nancy sitting up in bed, her face pale and convulsed, her blue eyes streaming with tears, her little pink mouth quivering. "Nancy," began Mrs. Gregg in a weighty tone, but Mrs. Dunn sprang forward and threw her arms around the child. "You got frightened, didn't you?" whispered she, and Nancy clung to her for dear life. A great wave of joyful tenderness rolled up in the heart of the bereaved woman. It was not, after all, the lonely and fearfully wandering little spirit of her dear Jenny. She was peaceful and blessed, beyond all her girlish tumults and terrors, but it was this little living girl. She saw it all plainly now. Afterwards, it seemed to her that any one but a woman with her nerves strained and her imagination unhealthily keen through watching and sorrow would have seen it before. She held Nancy tight and soothed her. She felt almost as if she held her own Jenny. "I guess I'll take her home with me if you don't care," she said to Mrs. Gregg. "Why, I don't know as I've got any objections if you want to," answered Mrs. Gregg with cold stateliness. "Nancy Wren has had everything done for her that I was able to do," she added, when Mrs. Dunn had wrapped up the child and they were all on the stairs. "I ain't coaxed and cuddled her because it ain't my way. I never did with my own children." "Oh, I know you've done all you could," said Mrs. Dunn with abstracted apology. "I just thought I'd like to take her home tonight. Don't you think I'm blaming you, Miss Gregg?" She bent down and kissed the little tearful face on her shoulder. She was carrying Nancy like a baby. Flora had hold of one of her little dangling hands. "You should go right upstairs and sleep with Flora," Mrs. Dunn whispered in the child's ear when they were going across the yard, "and you shall have the lamp burning all night, and I'll give you a piece of cake before you go." It was the custom of the Dunns to visit the cemetery and carry flowers to Jenny's grave every Sunday afternoon. Next Sunday, little Nancy went with them. She followed happily along and did not seem to think of the Blake lot. That pitiful fancy, if fancy it were, which had peopled her empty childish world with ghostly kindred, which had led into it an angel playmate in white robe and crown, might lie at rest now. There was no more need for it. She had found her place in a nest of living hearts, and she was getting her natural food of human love. They had dressed Nancy in one of the little white frocks which Jenny had worn in her childhood, and her hat was trimmed with some ribbon and rosebuds which had adorned one of the dead young girls years before. It was a beautiful Sunday. After they left the cemetery, they strolled a little way down the road. The road lay between deep green meadows and cottage yards. It was not quite time for the roses, and the lilacs were turning grey. The buttercups in the meadows had blossomed out, but the dandelions had lost their yellow crowns, and their filmy skulls appeared. They stood like ghosts among crowds of golden buttercups, but none of the family thought of that. Their ghosts were laid in peace. And that's the end of A Gentle Ghost. And that brings us to a break. So you can all feel nice and good about that one. It is really sweet, right? Like, I'm getting a bit emotional at the end of that one. I've read it I've already read it before. And yeah, that's one that actually gets me. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed that. The next one after the break will be a bit different. But yeah, we can chat about that after the break. So I'll see you back in 5 minutes or so. Rotate those fluids, stretch your legs, if you got them, and we'll see you back here in a bit. Bye for now. we're back. I hope that everyone's had a good break. Yeah, as for the people catching up that don't have access to Twitch chat, I just in the course of the break time conversation, I happened to say I don't know how many states I travel through in the course of one story, and yeah, quite correctly, I do lean more Southern Belle. I guess I just feel that is I think a much more familiar accent for me to drop into when trying to do something American. But it's consistent. Okay, I will take consistent. Yeah, if I actually had to try and do a New England accent, I couldn't really tell you off the top of my head what that sounds like. Probably the closest I can think of would be like a Boston kind of thing, but I figure that's not all New England. That's very specific. Boston is New England, right? And I'm not going to attempt a Boston accent if so. But anything else, I couldn't actually. You're from Boston, you can't do the Boston accent. Ah, okay, it's one of those. Yeah, it's that Boston accent is one that I can identify. Couldn't do. Not even going to attempt. Not even any of the typical phrases. Park the car at Harvard Yard. Not going to do it. But yeah, and so yeah, I figured that because these are set in New England and written as such that is an accent that I should be attempting, but that's not one I know. But yeah, I'm just going to keep doing Southern Belle. In Northern Maine they don't have strong accents, but it's subtly weird. Great. Yeah, no, I'll keep on doing what I'm doing. But it seems like it's working out okay. What else was I going to say? Yeah, actually, okay, two things. Firstly, it's because I am a belt. Well, thank you, Harper. It's very kind. No. I was going to say ding dong, but that's going too far. I should just take the compliment. What was I going to say? Yeah, so I realised I made a comment beforehand about what I love about this writing is if she's describing a fence post, she won't tell you that it's brown and made of wood, but she will tell you what it thinks of you. That's not true. Because literally, as I'm reading this, she is describing a lot of the shape and colour and the things in the environment. But for some reason, the way that it's written, I get a much more. And then, this is where I should have studied English Lit, says the guy who did study English Lit at A level at least. I would need to actually go and do some kind of literary critical analysis of the way she writes to try and figure out why it is from her writing I get a lot more emotiveness and atmosphere and ambience than other stuff. There is an amount, I suppose, of personification still that it's just kind of seeded through the text. It's not in the way that everything is described, but there's just a lot of. And I guess thinking about it now, it kind of makes sense that she's writing ghost stories, or that she wrote ghost stories and things like this, because yeah, just a lot of things in her world seem to be imbued with a sense of life. There was a tweet doing the rounds on Writing Twitter a few weeks ago talking about how instead of just saying a thing is there, talk about what effect it has on the environment around it. Kind of reminds you of that. Yeah, it's that kind of thing. It's again, there is a presence, there is a personality that seems to be assigned to everything that is mentioned in the story, whether it's people, whether it's people's features. Features have their own personalities when she's writing them, and that kind of thing. And kind of the thing that I love about that first one is that it starts off with a gaggle of older women touring through a graveyard, and it's not about them. It's about the little girl it's kind of about the little girl that they meet in the graveyard, but mostly it switches focus to the family that lives across the road in the graveyard, who the old women see as they're leaving, and it's I don't know, I like that flow, I like that direction, that it doesn't start with the Flora, and I've already forgotten the name. Like, finish a story, characters are gone, poof, out the head. Yeah, Flora and Mrs. Dunn, the Dunn family. There you go. Like, it doesn't start with them and just focus on them from start to finish. It starts elsewhere and then moves to them, and it's just, I don't know. It's just really nicely written, and I don't feel like I encounter, so far from the other stuff that we've read in the past couple of years now of doing this, I've not encountered a lot of other stories that have felt like these, and that's why I just kind of, I don't know, get really excited over them, I suppose. And where was it? There was one particular passage. You might have heard me fiddling with the pages because I was folding over a corner because I wanted to come back to it. Where was it? There was one particular bit that I absolutely loved and wanted to come back to. It's the description of Flora's face, or Flora and her mother. Her mother looked like her. As to the expression, the features were widely different. It was as if both had passed through one corroding element which had given them the similarity of scars. Like, what a sentence that is! That is such a good description. I love it. Like, I mean, first time I read it just by myself, I was like, ooh, that's real good. And then again, this one, I was like, oh yeah, I remember pointing that out to myself. I was like, damn, that slaps. Like, yeah. It's so good. I want to hold that line up and be like, look at this. This is great. Like how an episode of The Simpsons goes through 2 or 3 plot devices before landing on the main plot. Yes, like that. Malcolm in the Middle. I remember once. I will get to the next story soon. Sorry for podcast listeners. There was a writer, Daniel O'Brien, who used to write Cracked, and now does a lot of very high up stuff for TV shows that you have heard of. Talking about how good the plotting in Malcolm in the Middle is, how just fast and sharp and efficient it gets into in the opening minute of an episode. It will set up multiple different cohesive plots for different characters and run with them all to some incredible joke resolution and tie them all off by the end of the sort of 20-25 minute episode in a way that most other TV shows should be jealous of. And it's I'm just some guy who'd watch Malcolm in the Middle and go, oh, this is funny, haha, lol. But yeah, seeing someone who can appreciate it put it out like that, oh yeah, actually they were doing some really good stuff on that show. Yeah. That is off on a tangent, but she's saying about Simpsons establishing plot lines. That made me think of that. Hi, we do tangents here. Anyway, I might just be putting off reading the next one because, as I was saying in chat, it is all spoken dialogue, more or less. It is 80% spoken dialogue. That's practically all. That's enough for a venue to declare sold out. So, this one's going to be fun. Get ready for the Southern Belle to return, folks. You have faith in me? I thank you. I'm glad someone does. A lot of people do. That's a lie. Thank you for your faith in me. But yeah, chair creaks out the way. Joey fast asleep in his large cardboard box. I've got water. Alright, let's go. This is Luella Miller. Close to the village street stood the one-story house in which Luella Miller, who had an evil name in the village, had dwelt. She had been dead for years, yet there were those in the village who, in spite of the clearer light which comes on a vantage point from a long past danger, half believed in the tale which they had heard from their childhood. In their hearts, although they scarcely would have owned it, was a survival of the wild horror and frenzied fear of their ancestors who had dwelt in the same age with Luella Miller. Young people, even, would stare with a shudder at the old house as they passed, and children never played around it, as was their wont, around an untenanted building. Not a window in the old Miller house was broken. The panes reflected the morning sunlight in patches of emerald and blue, and the latch of the sagging front door was never lifted, although no bolt secured it. Since Luella Miller had been carried out of it, the house had had no tenant, except one friendless old soul who had no choice between that and the far-off shelter of the open sky. This old woman, who had survived her kindred and friends, lived in the house 1 week. Then one morning no smoke came out of the chimney, and a body of neighbours, a score strong, entered and found her dead in her bed. There were dark whispers as to the cause of her death, and there were those who testified to an expression of fear so exalted that it showed forth the state of the departing soul upon the dead face. The old woman had been hale and hearty when she entered the house, and in 7 days she was dead. It seemed that she had fallen a victim to some uncanny power. The minister talked in the pulpit with covert severity against the sin of superstition. Still the belief prevailed. Not a soul in the village but would have chosen the almshouse rather than that dwelling. No vagrant, if he heard the tale, would seek shelter beneath that old roof, unhallowed by nearly half a century of superstitious fear. There was only one person in the village who had actually known Luella Miller. That person was a woman well over 80, but a marvel of vitality and unextinct youth. Straight as an arrow, with the spring of one recently let loose from the bow of life, she moved about the streets, and she always went to church, rain or shine. She had never married, and had lived alone for years in a house across the road from Luella Miller's. This woman had none of the garrulousness of age, but never in all her life had she ever held her tongue for any will save her own, and she never spared the truth when she essayed to present it. She it was who bore testimony to the life, evil though possibly wittingly or designedly so, of Luella Miller, and to her personal appearance. When this old woman spoke, and she had the gift of description, although her thoughts were clothed in the rude vernacular of her native village, one could seem to see Luella Miller as she had really looked. According to this woman, Lydia Anderson by name, Luella Miller had been a beauty of a type rather unusual in New England. She had been a slight, pliant sort of creature, as ready with a strong yielding to fate as as unbreakable as a willow. She had glimmering lengths of straight, fair hair which she wore softly looped round a long, lovely face. She had blue eyes, full of soft, pleading, little, slender, clinging blue eyes full of soft, pleading, little, slender, clinging hands, and a wonderful grace of motion and attitude. Luella Miller used to sit in a way nobody else could if they sat up and studied a week of Sundays, said Lydia Anderson, and it was a sight to see her walk. If one of them willows over there on the edge of the brook could start up and get its roots free of the ground and move off, it would go just the way Luella Miller used to. She had a green shot silk that she used to wear, too, and a hat with green ribbon streamers, and a lace veil blowing across her face and out sideways, and a green ribbon flying from her waist. That was what she came out bride in when she married Erastus Miller. Her name before she was married was Hill. There was always a side of L's in her name, married or single. Erastus Miller was good-looking, too, better-looking than Luella. Sometimes I used to think that Luella wasn't so handsome after all. Erastus just about worshipped her. I used to know him pretty well. He lived next door to me, and we went to school together. Folks used to say he was waiting on me, but he wasn't. I never thought he was, except once or twice when he said things that some girls might have suspected meant something. That was before Luella came here to teach the district school. It was funny how she came to get it, for folks said she hadn't any education, and that one of the big girls, Lottie Henderson, used to do all the teaching for her while she sat back and did embroidery work on the cambric pocket handkerchief. Lottie Henderson was a real smart girl, a splendid scholar, and she just set her eyes by Luella, as all the girls did. Lottie would have made a real smart woman, but she died when Luella had been here about a year. Just faded away and died. Nobody knew what aided her. She dragged herself to that schoolhouse and helped Luella teach till the very last minute. The committee all knew how Luella didn't do much of the work herself, but they winked at it. It wasn't long after Lottie died that Erastus married her. I always thought he hurried it up because she wasn't fit to teach. One of the big boys used to help her after Lottie died, but he hadn't much government, and the school didn't do very well, and Luella might have had to give it up, for the committee couldn't have shut their eyes to things much longer. The boy that helped her was a real honest, innocent sort of fellow, and he was a good scholar too. Folks said he overstudied, and that was the reason he was took crazy the year after Luella married, but I don't know. And I don't know what made Erastus Miller go into consumption of the blood the year after he was married. Consumption wasn't in his family. He just grew weaker and weaker, and went almost bent double when he tried to wait on Luella, and he spoke feeble like an old man. He worked terrible hard till the last, trying to save up a little to leave Luella. I've seen him out in the worst storms on the wood sled. He used to cut and sell wood, and he was hunched up on top looking more dead than alive. Once I couldn't stand it. I went over and helped him pitch some wood on the cart. I was always strong in my arms. I wouldn't stop for all he told me to, and I guess he was glad enough for the help. That was only a week before he died. He fell on the kitchen floor while he was getting breakfast. He always got the breakfast and let Luella lay abed. He did all the sweeping and the washing and the ironing and most of the cooking. He couldn't bear to have Luella lift her finger, and she let him do for her. She lived like a queen for all the work she did. She didn't even do her sewing. She said it made her shoulder ache to sew, and poor Erastus' sister Lily used to do all her sewing. She wasn't able to either. She was never strong in her back, but she did it beautifully. She had to suit Luella. She was so dreadful particular. I never saw anything like the faggoting and ham-stitching that Lily Miller did for Luella. She made all Luella's wedding outfit and that green silk dress after Maria Babbitt cut it. Maria, she cut it for nothing, and she did a lot more cutting and fitting for nothing for Luella too. Lily Miller went to live with Luella after Erastus died. She gave up her home, though she was real attached to it and wasn't mad afraid to stay alone. She rented it and went to live with Luella right away after the funeral. Then, this old woman, Lydia Anderson, who remembered Luella Miller, would go on to relate the story of Lily Miller. It seemed that on the removal of Lily Miller to the house of her dead brother, to live with his widow, the village people first began to talk. This Lily Miller had been hardly past her first youth, and a most robust and blooming woman, rosy-cheeked with curls of strong black hair overshadowing round, candid temples and bright dark eyes. It was not 6 months after she had taken up her residence with her sister-in-law that her rosy colour faded, and her pretty curves became wan hollows. White shadows began to show in the black rings of her hair, and the light died out of her eyes. Her features sharpened, and there were pathetic lines at her mouth, which yet wore always an expression of utter sweetness and even happiness. She was devoted to her sister. There was no doubt that she loved her with her whole heart, and was perfectly content in her service. It was her sole anxiety lest she should die and leave her alone. The way Lily Miller used to talk about Luella was enough to make you mad and enough to make you cry, said Lydia Anderson. I've been in there sometimes toward the last when she was too feeble to cook, and carried her some blancmange or custard, something I thought she might relish, and she'd thank me, and when I asked her how she was, say she felt better than she did yesterday, and asked me if I didn't think she looked better, dreadful pitiful, and say poor Luella had an awful time taking care of her and doing the work. She wasn't strong enough to do anything, when all the time Luella wasn't lifting a finger. And poor Lily didn't get any care except what the neighbors gave her, and Luella ate up everything that was carried in for Lily. I had it real straight that she did. Luella used to just sit and cry and do nothing. She did act real fond of Lily, and she pined away considerable too. There were those that thought she'd go into a decline herself, but after Lily died, her Aunt Abby Mixter came, and then Luella picked up and grew as fat and rosy as ever. But poor Aunt Abby began to droop just the way Lily had, and I guess somebody wrote to her married daughter, Mrs. Sam Abbott, who lived in Bar, for she wrote her mother that she must leave right away and come make her a visit. But Aunt Abby wouldn't go. I can see her now. She was a real good-looking woman, tall and large, with a big square face and a high forehead that looked of itself kind of benevolent and good. She just tended out on Luella as if she had been a baby, and when a married daughter sent for her, she wouldn't stir 1 inch. She'd always thought a lot of her daughter too, but she said Luella needed her and her married daughter didn't. Her daughter kept writing and writing, but it didn't do any good. Finally she came, and when she saw how bad her mother looked, she broke down and cried, and all but went on her knees to have her come away. She spoke her minds to Luella too. She told her that she'd killed her husband and everybody that had anything to do with her, and that she'd thank her to leave her mother alone. Luella went into hysterics, and Aunt Abby was so frightened that she called me after her daughter went. Mrs. Sam Abbott, she went away fairly crying out loud in the buggy. The neighbors heard her, and well she might, for she never saw her mother alive again. I went in that night, and when Aunt Abby called for me, standing in the door with her little green checked shawl over her head. I can see her now. "Do come over here, Miss Anderson," she sung out, kind of gasping for breath. I didn't stop for anything. I put over as fast as I could, and when I got there, there was Luella laughing and crying all together, and Aunt Abby trying to hush her. And all the time she herself was white as a sheet and shaking so she could hardly stand. "For the land's sakes, Mrs. Mixter," says I, "you look worse than she does. You ain't fit to be up out of your bed." "Oh, there ain't anything the matter with me," says she. Then she went on talking to Luella. There, don't, poor little lamb," says she. "Aunt Abby is here. She ain't going away and leave you. Don't, poor little lamb." "Do leave her with me, Mrs. Mixter, and you get back to bed," says I, for Aunt Abby had been laying down considerable lately, though somehow she contrived to do the work. "I'm well enough," says she. "Don't you think she'd better have the doctor, Miss Anderson?" "The doctor?" says I. "I think you had better have the doctor. I think you need him much worse than some folks I could mention." And I looked right straight at Luella Miller, laughing and crying and going and on as if she was the center of all creation. All the time she was acting so, seemed as if she was too sick to sense anything. She was keeping a sharp lookout as to how we took it out of the corner of one eye. I see her. You could never cheat me about Luella Miller. Finally, I got real mad, and I run home, and I got a bottle of valerian I had, and I poured some boiling hot water on a handful of catnip, and I mixed up that catnip tea with most half a wine glass of valerian, and I went with it over to Luella's. I marched right up to Luella, a-holding out that cup all smoking. "Now," says I, "Luella Miller, you swallow this." What is it? Oh, what is it?" she sort of screeches out. Then she goes off a-laughing, enough to kill. "Poor lamb, poor little lamb," says Aunt Abby, standing over her, all kind of tottery and trying to bathe her hair with camphor. "You swallow this right down," says I. And I didn't waste any ceremony. I just took hold of Luella Miller's chin, and I tipped her head back, and I caught her mouth open and laughing, and I clapped that cup to her lips, and I fairly hollered at her, "Swallow, swallow, swallow," and she gulped it right down. She had to, and I guess it did her good. Anyhow, she stopped crying and laughing and let me put her to bed, and she went to sleep like a baby inside of half an hour. That was more than poor Aunt Abby did. She lay awake all that night, and I stayed with her, though she tried not to have me. Said she weren't sick enough for watchers. But I stayed, and I made some good cornmeal gruel, and I fed her a teaspoon every little while all night long. It seemed to me as if she was just dying from being all wore out. In the morning, as soon as it was light, I run over to the Bisbees and sent Johnny Bisbee for the doctor. I told him to tell the doctor to hurry, and he come pretty quick. Poor Aunt Abby didn't seem to know much of anything when he got here. You couldn't hardly tell she breathed, she was so used up. When the doctor had gone, Luella came into the room looking like a baby in a ruffled nightgown. I can see her now. Her eyes were as blue and her face all pink and white like a blossom, and she looked at Aunt Abby in the bed, sort of innocent and surprised. "Why?" says she. "Aunt Abby ain't got up yet." "No, she ain't," says I, pretty short. "I thought I didn't smell the coffee," says Luella. "Coffee," says I. "I guess if you have coffee this morning, you'll make it yourself." "I never made the coffee in all my life," says she, dreadful astonished. "Erastus always used to make the coffee as long as he lived, and then Lily, she made it, and then Aunt Abby made it. I don't believe I can make the coffee, Miss Anderson." "You can make it or go without, just as you please," says I. "Ain't Aunt Abby going to get up?" says she. "I guess she won't get up," says I, sick as she is. I was getting madder and madder. There was something about that little pink and white thing standing there and talking about coffee, when she had killed so many better folks than she was, and had just killed another, that made me feel most as if I wished somebody would up and kill her before she had a chance to do any more harm. "Is Aunt Abby sick?" says Luella, as if she was sort of aggrieved and injured. "Yes," says I. "She's sick and she's going to die. And then you'll be left alone, and you'll have to do for yourself and wait on yourself, or do without things." I don't know, but I was sort of hard, but it was the truth, and if I was any harder than Luella Miller had been, I'll give up. I ain't never been sorry that I said it. Well, Luella, she up and had hysterics again at that, and I just let her have 'em. All I did was to bundle her into the room on the other side of the entry where Aunt Abby couldn't hear her if she walked past it. I don't know, but she was, and set her down hard in a chair and told her not to come back into the other room, and she minded. She had her hysterics in there till she got tired. When she found out that nobody was coming to coddle her and do for her, she stopped. At least I suppose she did. I had all I could do with poor Aunt Abby trying to keep the breath of life in her. The doctor had told me that she was dreadful low, and give me some very strong medicine to give to her in drops real often, and told me real particular about the nourishment. Well, I did as he told me real faithful till she wasn't able to swallow any longer. Then I had her daughter sent for. I begun to realize that she wouldn't last any time at all. I hadn't realized it before, though I spoke to Luella the way I did. The doctor, he came, and Mrs. Sam Abbott, but when she got there it was too late. Her mother was dead. Aunt Abby's daughter just gave one look at her mother laying there. Then she turned sort of sharp and sudden and looked at me. "Where is she?" says she, and I knew she meant Luella. "She's out in the kitchen," says I. "She's too nervous to see folks die. She's afraid it will make her sick." The doctor, he speaks up then. He was a young man. Old Dr. Park had died the year before, and this was a young fellow just out of college. "Mrs. Miller's not strong," says he, kind of severe, "and she is acting quite right in not agitating herself." "You are another young man. She's got her pretty claw on you," thinks I, but I didn't say anything to him. I just said over to Mrs. Sam Abbott that Luella was in the kitchen, and Mrs. Sam Abbott, she went over there, and I went too, and I never heard anything like the way she talked to Luella Miller. I felt pretty hard to Luella myself, but this was more than I ever would have dared to say. Luella, she was too scared to go into hysterics. She just flopped. She seemed to just shrink away to nothing in that kitchen chair, with Mrs. Sam Abbott standing over her and talking and telling her the truth. I guess the truth was most too much for her, and no mistake, because Luella presently actually did faint away, and there warn't any sham about it, the way I always suspected there was about them hysterics. She fainted dead away, and we had to lay her flat on the floor, and the doctor, he came running out, and he said something about a weak heart, dreadful fears to Mrs. Sam Abbott, but she wasn't a mite scared. She faced him just as white as even Luella was laying there, looking like death, and the doctor feeling of her pulse. "Weak heart," says she. "Weak heart, weak fiddlesticks. There ain't nothing weak about that woman. She's got strength enough to hang on to other folks till she kills 'em. Weak? It was my poor mother that was weak. This woman killed her as sure as if she had taken a knife to her." But the doctor, he didn't pay much attention. He was bending over Luella, laying there with her yellow hair all streaming, and her pretty pink and white face all pale, and her blue eyes like stars gone out, and he was holding onto her hand and smoothing her forehead and telling me to get the brandy in Aunt Abby's room, and I was sure as I wanted to be that Luella had got somebody else to hang on to. Now Aunt Abby was gone, and I thought of poor Erastus Miller, and I sort of pitied the poor young doctor, led away by a pretty face, and I made up my mind I'd see what I could do. I waited till Aunt Abby had been dead and buried about a month, and the doctor was going to see Luella steady, and folks were beginning to talk. Then one evening, when I knew the doctor had been called out of town and wouldn't be round, I went over to Luella's. I found her all dressed up in a blue muslin with white polka dots on it, and her hair curled just as pretty, and there warn't a young girl in the place could compare with her. There was something about Luella Miller seemed to draw the heart right out of you, but she didn't draw it out of me. She was sitting rocking in the chair by her sitting-room window, and Maria Brown had gone home. Maria Brown had been in to help her, or rather to do the work, for Luella wasn't helped when she didn't do anything. Maria Brown was real capable, and she didn't have any ties. She wasn't married, and lived alone, so she'd offered. I couldn't see why she should do the work any more than Luella. She wasn't any too strong. But she seemed to think she could, and Luella seemed to think so too, so she went over and did all the work. Washed and ironed and baked while Luella sat and rocked. Maria didn't live long afterward. She began to fade away, just the same fashion the others had. Well, she was warned, but she acted real mad when folks said anything. Said Luella was a poor, abused woman, too delicate to help herself, and they'd ought to be ashamed, and if she died helping them that couldn't help themselves, she would. And she did. "I suppose Maria has gone home," says I to Luella when I had gone in and sat down opposite her. "Yes, Maria went half an hour ago after she got supper and washed the dishes," says Luella in her pretty way. "I suppose she has got a lot of work to do in her own house tonight," says I, kind of bitter, but that was all thrown away on Luella Miller. It seems to her right that folks that weren't any better able than she was herself should wait on her, and she couldn't get it through her head that anybody should think it weren't right. "Yes," says Luella, real sweet and pretty. "Yes, she had said she had to do washing tonight. She has let it go for a fortnight along of coming here." "Why don't she stay home and do her washing instead of coming over here and doing your work, when you are just as well able, and enough sight more so than she is, to do it?" says I. Then Luella, she looked at me like a baby who has a rattle shook at it. She sort of laughed as innocent as you please. "Oh, I can't do the work myself, Miss Anderson," says she. "I never did. Maria has to do it." Then I spoke out. "Has to do it," says I. "Has to do it. She don't have to do it either. She don't have to do it either. Maria Brown has her own home and enough to live on. She ain't beholden to you to come over here and slave for you and kill herself." Luella, she just sat and stared at me for a while, for all the world like a doll baby that was so abused that it was coming to life. "Yes," says I, "she's killing herself. She's going to die just like the way Erastus did, and Lily, and your Aunt Abby. You're killing her just as you did them. I don't know what there is about you, but you seem to bring a curse, says I. You kill everybody that is fool enough to care anything about you and do for you. She stared at me, and she was pretty pale. And Maria ain't the only one you're going to kill, says I. You're going to kill Dr. Malcolm before you're done with him. Then a red color came flaming all over her face. I ain't going to kill him either, says she, and she began to cry. Yes, you be, says I. Then I spoke as I had never spoke before. You see, I felt it on account of Erastus. I told her that she hadn't any business to think of another man after she'd been married to the one that had died for her. That she was a dreadful woman, and that she was, that's true enough, and she was, that's true enough, but sometimes I have wondered lately if she knew it. If she weren't like a baby with scissors in its hand, cutting everybody without knowing what it was doing. Luella, she kept getting paler and paler, and she never took her eyes off my face. There was something awful about the way she looked at me and never spoke one word. After a while I quit talking and I went home. I watched that night, but her lamp went out before 9 o'clock, and when Dr. Malcolm came driving past, he sort of slowed up. He see there wasn't any light, and he drove along. I saw her sort of shy out of meeting the next Sunday, too, so he shouldn't go home with her, and I began to think maybe she did have some conscience after all. It was only a week after that Maria Brown died. Sort of sudden at the last, though everybody had seen it coming. Well, then there was a good deal of feeling and pretty dark whispers. Folks said that days of witchcraft had come again, and they were pretty shy of Luella. She acted sort of offish to the doctor, and he didn't go there, and there wasn't anybody to do anything for her. I don't know how she did get along. I wouldn't go in there and offer to help her, not because I was afraid of dying like the rest, but I thought she was just as well able to do her own work as I was to do it for her, and I thought it was about time that she did it and stopped killing other folks. But it wasn't very long before folks began to say that Luella herself was going into a decline just the way her husband and Lily and Aunt Abby and the others had, and I saw myself that she looked pretty bad. I used to see her going past from the store with a bundle as if she could hardly crawl, but I remembered how Erastus used to wait and tend when he could hardly put one foot in front of the other, and I didn't go out to help her. But at last, one afternoon, I saw the doctor come driving up like mad with his medicine chest. Then Mrs. Babbitt came in after supper and said that Luella was real sick. I'd offered to go in and nurse her, says she, but I've got my children to consider, and maybe it ain't true what they say, but it's queer how many folks queer how many folks that have done for her have died. I didn't say anything, but I considered how she had been Erastus' wife, and how he had set his eyes by her, and I made up my mind to go in the next morning, unless she was better, and see what I could do. But the next morning I see her at the window, and pretty soon she came stepping out as spry as you please, and a little while afterward Mrs. Babbitt came in and told me that the doctor had got a girl from out of town, a Sarah Jones, to come there, and she said she was pretty sure the doctor was going to marry Luella. I saw him kiss her in the door that night myself, and I knew it was true. The woman came that afternoon, and the way she flew around was a caution. I don't believe Luella had swept since Maria died. She swept and dusted and washed and ironed. Wet clothes and dusters and carpets were flying all over there all day. And every time Luella set her foot out, when the doctor weren't there was that Sarah Jones helping her up and down the steps as if she hadn't learned to walk. Well, everybody knew that Luella and the doctor were going to be married, but it wasn't long before they began to talk about his looking so poorly, just as they had about the others, and they talked about Sarah Jones, too. Well, the doctor did die, and he wanted to be married first so as to leave what little he had to Luella, but he died before the minister could get there, and Sarah Jones died a week afterward. Well, that wound up everything for Luella Miller. Not another soul in the whole town would lift a finger for her. There got to be a sort of panic. Then she began to droop in good earnest. She used to have to go to the store herself, for Mrs. Babbitt was afraid to let Tommy go for her, and I've seen her going past and stopping every 2 or 3 steps to rest. Well, I stood it as long as I could, But one day I see her coming with her arms full and stopping to lean against the Babbitt fence, and I ran out there and took her bundle and carried them to her house. Then I went home and never spoke one word to her, though she called after me dreadful kind of pitiful. Well, that night I was taken sick with a chill, and I was sick as I wanted to be for 2 weeks. Mrs. Babbitt had seen me run out to help Luella, and she came in and told me I was going to die on account of it. I didn't know whether I was or not, but I considered I had done right by Erastus's wife. That last 2 weeks, Luella, she had a dreadful hard time, I guess. She was pretty sick, and as near as I could make out, anybody dared go near her. As near as I could make out, nobody dared go near her. I don't know as she was really needing anything very much, for there was enough to eat in her house, and it was warm weather, and she made out to cook a little flour gruel every day, I know. But I guess she had a hard time, she that had been so petted and done for all her life. When I got so I could go out, I went over there one morning. Mrs. Babbitt had just come in to say she hadn't seen any smoke, and she didn't know but it was somebody's duty to go in, but she couldn't help thinking of her children, and I got right up, though I hadn't been out of the house for 2 weeks, and I went in there, and Luella was laying on the bed, and she was dying. She lasted all that day and into the night, but I sat there after the new doctor had gone away. Nobody else dared to go there. It was about midnight that I left her for a minute to run home and get some medicine I had been taking, for I began to feel rather bad. It was a full moon that night, and just as I started out from my door to cross the street back to Luella's, I stopped short, for I saw something. Lydia Anderson, at this juncture, always said with a certain defiance that she did not expect to be believed, and then proceeded in a hushed voice. I saw what I saw, and I know I saw it, and I will swear on my deathbed that I saw it. I saw Luella Miller and Erastus Miller and Lily and Aunt Abby and Maria and the doctor and Sarah all going out of her door, and all but Luella shone white in the moonlight, and they were all helping her along till she seemed to fairly fly in the midst of them. Then it all disappeared. I stood a minute with my heart pounding. Then I went over there. I thought of going for Mrs. Babbitt, but I thought she'd be afraid, so I went alone, though I knew what had happened. Luella was laying real peaceful, dead on her bed. This was the story that the old woman, Lydia Anderson, told, but the sequel was told by the people who survived her, and this is the tale which has become folklore in the village. Lydia Anderson died when she was 87. She had continued wonderfully hale and hearty for one of her years until about 2 weeks before her death. One bright moonlight evening she was sitting beside a window in her parlour when she made a sudden exclamation, and was out of the house and across the street before the neighbour who was taking care of her could stop her. She followed as fast as possible and found Lydia Anderson stretched on the ground before the door of Luella Miller's deserted house, and she was quite dead. The next night there was a red gleam of fire athwart the moonlight, and the old house of Luella Miller was burned to the ground. Nothing is now left of it except a few old cellar stones and a lilac bush, and in summer a helpless trail of morning glories among the weeds, which might be considered emblematic of Luella herself. Thank you for listening. And this concludes the tale of Luella Miller. Yeah, so we got through it. That was difficult. But yeah, I enjoyed that one. I think that one was good. Luella Miller, perhaps some kind of lich, who knows? Some kind of house chore lich who, you know, as Andy Pants puts it, and choosing to interpret this as a cautionary tale about having to do chores, how having to do chores will literally kill you, yes. That checks out. Wow, catnip tea was traditionally used as a herbal medicine for restlessness, nervousness, and nervous disorders. A bunch of other things. Lovely. Okay, yeah. Ugh, how's everyone doing? Oh, thank you, Harpers. And Andy for the claps. Yeah, my voice is, I think, audibly going. But, you know, we got into some good practice on Southern Belle American accent. Ugh. Yeah, I hope that everyone has enjoyed that. I feel now like we should have more of a discussion at the end, but I guess we can save that for. Well, we could discuss things now if people want to discuss things, or save that for like whenever the next podcast stream is going to be. I don't know. But yeah, if anyone has any notes that they wish to bring up after that, I don't know. I feel like this is another one with some very good descriptions, and I'm trying to remember now because I didn't flag them up the way I did with the other one. But yeah. See, maybe Monday for next literacy. Yeah, I guess because I keep thinking today is Sunday, obviously, because we had D&D. But no, we could try and aim for Monday. Yeah, that might be nice. As I thought, yeah, possibly come back on Monday for the podcast and playing more Scarlet Hollow. That'd be nice. Tile repair is almost done on the clean-up stage of things. Nice. Congratulations. Chiliteracy's gone live. Oh, sick. We should raid them. It's a good channel. It's a fun thing to listen to while working. No, well, I'm glad. Thank you. I'm glad to have accompanied you whilst doing the working. But yeah, I like that one. I kind of it feels both ambiguous and not. Like, it's a first-person account of someone who obviously had some very strong feelings about this Luella Miller character, who, as described, seems to kind of be aware that she was almost, I guess, pathologically lazy, but also and thus literally draining the life, lich-like, out of whoever was unlucky enough to fall under her spell and come to work for her. That's kind of how she existed and subsisted, like this. But also, I don't know. I still myself kind of feel a little bit sorry for her being like bound to this existence as well. I don't know if that's meant to be there or not. But I kind of feel a little bit like Miss Anderson. Again, I finish a story. I do not retain the names. Whoever, yeah, our narrator. Miss Anderson, Lydia Anderson. There you go. Lydia Anderson herself seems to have kind of some sympathy as well as she puts it, like some hard feelings. One wonders if there's some kind of unreliable narrator thing going on here too. Well, that's the thing. It's like if either like Luella Miller is some kind of lich demon who drains the life out of all her care workers, or drains the life out of people who she kind of lures in with a spell to come and do all her house chores and care for her up until their dying minute, and she's fully aware, and therefore some kind of, say, evil vampire demon witch thing, or if not, boy, she's having a miserable life, isn't she? Everyone who comes to care for her drops dead. She is presumably, like in need of a lot of care and attention and help, and yeah, needs people to come and like care for her because she's completely incapable of doing these things herself. And it turns out they all just keep dying, and she gets more and more ostracized by the people around her who refuses to help her. The people around her who refuse to help her. Yeah, let's get the tenses right. Or it's an eldritch horror in the house her house accepts other people as sacrifices. Yes. I hadn't considered that. Yeah, exactly. It's actually just a haunted house. She doesn't know what's going on. She's like, why do people keep dying when they come in here to help me? I'm also having a bad time, folks. But you just blame me. And actually, it's just a house devouring people. I like that. But yeah, I don't feel that it is completely clear and point. Sure, it's called Llewellyn Miller. But I don't feel like it is completely straight up cut and dry that no, she is obviously the baddie here and draining the life essence out of everyone around her. I feel like there's a few possible ways to read this, and I like that. She's the light of the anglerfish. Ooh, see, that is making me think of a monster from Acquisitions Incorporated, the C-Team, which is a D&D campaign run by Jerry Hawkins, Tycho, goes by, from Penny Arcade. The C-Team being a spin-off of their main D&D series, Acquisitions Incorporated, which it's kind of spoilers because the reveal is very cool. But there is a monster which essentially it sends out thousands and thousands of like enchanted lockets, where if you open it, you see like a young woman inside who she's clearly in distress and calling for help, and like pointing. There's like a window behind her, and she's like pointing out the window, and so you can kind of figure out where she is, but you can't hear what she's saying or anything. And travelers go to like find her and rescue her. Like, this woman is in distress and need help. I should go and get her. And the team, the party, travel to find her. Eventually, managing to pin down her location and sort of travel to there. And it's basically, yes, like an anglerfish. She's kind of like a hello. Sorry, Joey's asking for attention. Hello. No, I have cat now. It's like some kind of monster, and she the woman is sort of like I don't really know, but like the light on an anglerfish. Basically, it's like hanging, suspended, by this as like a part of this much larger monster, which is what it uses to lure people as they're like sailing there. The sea is just full of these lockets all floating on the surface. It just like sends them out like pods, like seeds, to try and trick people to pull them in. And it's really cool. It's really clever. You have recently read Into the Drowning Deep, which is a great thriller by Mira Grant. Okay. Neat. Cool. Okay, sorry, Joey wants to go out, so I have to let him. And I'm pretty sure Lucy and I got past that point, so I don't think I'm spoiling it for her when I say all this about it. But yeah, that's what that's made me think of. But yeah, I enjoy that story again. Like, it's just the descriptions, the place, the presence, the people. It's all very good. It's all really enjoyable to read. It just hits right. But yeah, I think that brings us to a point where I can close the stream. As I said earlier, if you happen to miss the very start, there was a cold open, which will be included in the highlight and the YouTube VOD. I don't see anybody live that I wish to raid. The chiptune show that I was watching earlier has finished. I'm not going to raid, but I will give a channel recommendation while it's still up. Because it's kind of been nice and chill. And Lucy probably knows where I'm going with this one, because I've been talking to her about it. It is this place. It's I think a Swedish public access TV channel that I think every year there's a moose migration in Sweden, and they have, I don't know how often they've done it, but certainly this year, and I guess previous years, While that is going on, or expected to be happening, they run a bunch of cameras and have like a live rolling 24-hour channel that is essentially just day and night shots of open snow-covered Swedish wilderness, with the prospect of maybe a moose. And it's just been real nice putting that on in the background. Some of the ambient sounds, if anything else, is really lovely. Exactly, moose or meese, depending. But it's been really nice. I sort of found it the other day, and yeah, just sort of throw it on in the background. Chat can be quite busy, which is why I don't particularly want to raid over there, because like going from this, which is nice and quiet and chilled, to 1,000+ people talking about things, although they tend to go in emo only mode when they shut down for the night, which is quite funny. But yeah, that's my channel recommendation. As I say, I can't be bothered to actually raid over. Not that it really takes much more effort, but you know how it be. But yeah, there's that. So I don't know if you want to stick something chill in the background after this, do that. But I have no authority here. So I'm not going to tell you what to do. But for now, do remember to come back probably on Monday. I will try to put out either a yes or a no on Monday on our socials, which is Twitter, if we are doing or not doing. And otherwise, yeah, see you then. See you Wednesday. See you hopefully back here next Saturday. Take care of yourselves and people around you, and just get my mouse over the right end screen. Well, thank you for being here, Andy, and everyone else as well. As I say, it's always fun, it's always a pleasure, and enjoy doing this stuff, and we will see you on the next one. Goodbye, good night, and have a good weekend.